January 1st, 1945. Asch Airfield Y-29, Belgium. The first shells blossomed at treetop height before the pilots could even retract their landing gear. White bursts cupping the German fighters in tight rings of shrapnel. What looked like another routine low-level strike to catch American Mustangs on the ground turned, in the seconds after liftoff, into a corridor of timed explosions that did not miss. The men in the cockpits had been taught for years how to read flak. Black puffs at altitude meant time fuses set too long. Grey puffs behind a wingtip meant a gun crew was slow on the crank. Scattered bursts across the horizon meant a battery firing blind. But these new bursts appeared where aircraft were going to be, not where they had been. In the radio chaos of the Luftwaffe's New Year's Day offensive operation, Bodenplatte pilots shouted bearings and warnings until the frequencies dissolved into noise. Several swore they had flown through empty air between orchards and hangars, only to watch shells detonate alongside their canopies, as if the gunners had reached up and pinched a plunger at precisely the right instant. They had not. The explosions were choosing their own moment. The proximity fuse had arrived in strength. Hours earlier, in briefing huts across the Low Countries, formation leaders drew lines to Allied airfields at Asch Airfield, Brussels, Eindhoven, and Melsbroek, promising one last clean blow to reset the winter air war. Doctrine said low-level minimized radar detection and made flak timing difficult. Doctrine had quietly expired in the last half of 1944 when Anglo-American batteries received a device that turned each shell into a tiny radar set. The variable time fuse VT, in U.S. nomenclature, posit in code-transformed anti-aircraft fire from a gambler's art into a proximity-driven geometry. Instead of guessing with mechanical clocks or praying for a graze hit, a gun crew sent a shell that sensed when it had drifted near metal and burst at that instant. The decisive variable shifted from human estimate to physics. The battle at Asch was a hard demonstration that word had not yet reached every German cockpit. The pilots expected to bounce parked fighters. Instead, they met American P-51s already scrambling from alert and an AA belt, wired with radar directors and VT fuses that punished any error in altitude or spacing. The first minutes were murderously specific. A keton of BF-109s broke over the tree line, and a second element disintegrated in a pattern of mid-air detonations bracketed at 20 or 30 meters. Close enough that fragment cones overlapped. Survivors hugged the ground, then pulled for the field, then watched more shells burst. Not late, not early, but where wings and tails were moving. The crews who had scoffed that Allied flak was guesswork now flew through shells that guessed for themselves. The proximity fuses road to this Belgian morning began years earlier and oceans away. British researchers, prodded by the misery of the 1940-41 Blitz, had chased the gunner's dream of a shell that would detonate when near a target instead of on contact or by clockwork. The concept was simple and savage. Put a tiny radio in the fuse. Let it transmit and measure the interference as the shell approached an airplane. When the reflected signal created the right Doppler signature, trigger the detonator. The engineering was not simple. A fuse had to survive tens of thousands of GI spin at high RPM and operate for seconds on a thread of battery power, while generating and reading a radio tone. The solution came from a transatlantic collaboration. The TIZAD mission carried British work to the United States in 1940, where the Naval Research Laboratory and an industrial constellation of Western Electric, Raytheon, and others ruggedized miniature vacuum tubes and power supplies. On the 12th of August 1942, off the Chesapeake, live drones died under proximity-fused 5-inch fire, and the Navy understood it possessed a weapon that multiplied every gun crew's accuracy. A quiet rule followed. At sea, use it widely. On land, keep the secret locked until the risk of enemy capture dropped to near zero. That rule explains why the device first achieved legend on warships in 1943 and then reappeared with earth-shaking effect in European skies and fields in 1940-45. Naval action reports in the Pacific recorded a new arithmetic, 5-inch AA, with VT accounted for a sharply rising fraction of kills, and the number of rounds per aircraft downed plummeted compared with mechanical time or contact fuses. The difference was not a romantic story. It was a statistical fact. Navy historians later normalized the results 2 rounds per kill, and found that proximity fuses regularly cut the expenditure dramatically compared to older methods. A shift that mattered when kamikaze raids closed fast and hit hard. By mid-1944, the device crossed a critical threshold in Europe. The combined chiefs allowed V-defused AA shells for the British coastal gunbelt, defending against the V1. Here was a target designed to humiliate gunners, small, fast, and indifferent to fear. Early in the campaign, conventional time fuses with radar prediction did passably. Then VT detonations began to blossom directly beside the flying bombs. Week by week, the interception rate surged. Accounts from the period record that along the coastal belt the proportion destroyed jumped from the 20s into the 60s, and then the high 70s. With one late August day reaching more than 4/5 of V1s detected destroyed before they crossed into London's heart. The public saw fewer impacts. The Luftwaffe did not see why. The device remained classified. Batteries were ordered to fire over water whenever possible, and the dud risk inland was managed to avoid German recovery. But pilots escorting low-level raids toward the Channel gun line began to report impossible bursts that seemed glued to their paths. It was not witchcraft. It was a self-tuning detonator that erased a second or two of human error. On land, the last barrier fell that winter. December 1944 opened with a German offensive in the Ardennes that tore open a seam in the Allied front and threatened bridges, depots, and cities, especially Antwerp, a logistics lung, without which nothing in northwest Europe could breathe. The same Joint Chiefs who had hoarded the fuse for fear of compromise authorized its use in field artillery and Continental AA, based on Eisenhower's insistence that the risk was outweighed by the danger. 2 very different uses followed. In the forests around Bastogne and St. Vith, American gunners set VT on 105s and 155s to airburst over infantry and road columns, turning tree canopies into lethal reflectors that doubled the fragment density at head height. The German soldiers who had learned to hug the frozen ground and ride out timed shrapnel now found the air itself, detonating a body's length above them. The effect, measured by casualty reports and prisoners' accounts, was disproportionate to the number of rounds fired, because the fuse removed the timing error that had left so many shells bursting a second too soon or too late. In the air defense of Antwerp and Liege, the device rewrote the map around approaches and assembly areas. 90mm batteries, paired with -584 Seychelles rupees, tracking radar, and the M9 directorate, electromechanical brain that spat out angles and lead could now crown their mathematics with a fuse that handled the final meter of uncertainty. The system did not need to be perfect. It only needed to put a sphere of sharp steel within a few meters of aluminum, moving at 100 meters per second. That is what it did. German pilots, taught that heavy flak was mostly a high-altitude bomber problem, and that low level blunted the gunner's teeth, discovered in late 1944 that the map had changed. Belgian and Dutch skies nearer to the ports had become a box where radar saw you, directors predicted you, and VT finished you. Operation Bodenplatte revealed both the audacity of Germany's last massed fighter blow in the West and the cost of assaulting fortified airspace wired with the Allies' late-war air defense stack. Just after dawn on New Year's Day, Gruppen surged for their targets, and in many places they struck hard, destroying or damaging scores of Allied aircraft on the ground. But the butcher's bill bled the Jagdwaff's last trained corps. Flak claims always invite caution. Gunners overclaim, pilots underreport, and wreck counts take days. But the pattern is clear in base histories and post-war analysis. Low-level attackers that pressed through the defended belts suffered losses at a rate they could not absorb, and proximity fuses were by then standard issue in the heaviest batteries guarding those belts. Even when a shell did not score a kill, a burst timed by physics, rather than guess, forced pilots to jink at the wrong moment or climb into fighters already rolling to take off, and a formation's spacing shattered. For a unit trained to fight as a package, cohesion was survival. VT's gift to the defenders was breaking packages apart. There is a stubborn myth that flak rarely downed fighters and mostly scared them. It was true often enough in 1942. It was not true against a lattice of radar-directed guns with proximity fuses in 1944-45, particularly when the attacker committed to the very altitudes where near misses grew fatal and every wingman shared the same narrow tunnel of air. The Luftwaffe's own war diaries record the attrition of their trained leaders through the last winter. A bleed accelerated by bold attacks into defended zones and by the absence of replacement pilots who could climb the learning curve fast enough. If you normalize the story, the way the ARVN, or US Army historians later did, for artillery rounds per effectu, see why the German experience shifted from contempt to alarm. A battery that once needed thousands of rounds to bring down a single aircraft at altitude could, under a good radar solution and with VT on the nose, produce lethal near-bursts in the first few salvos. In fighter sweeps over the Reich, the main killer was often another fighter. But over Antwerp or the Scheldt, and at the low heights of a strafing run, the first line of defense was gunnery. In that regime, shaving even half a second of error translated into bursts, triggered inside a formation's geometry rather than outside it. The human story is plain in crew rooms on both sides. American and British gunners talked about how it felt. Different, the confidence of seeing bursts walk into a target because the fuse made the last correction for them. German pilots described the opposite sensation. Flak that behaved like a thinking enemy, that did not waste shells ahead or behind, but arrived beside a cockpit that made the old trick-scut throttle over the guns. With under the burst, suddenly unreliable. Contemporary accounts from British coastal batteries in summer 1944 painted the same picture against V1 South. Once VT joined -584 Seychelles rupees and M9, the belt's weekly kill rate rose in measurable steps, into the high 70s along some sectors by late August, with individual days above 80%. Records vary by source and sector, but the direction of change is not disputed. The Luftwaffe's analysts were not fools. They saw the results, even if they did not know the cause. They noted that Allied AA lethality improved sharply in the latter half of 1944, and that approaches once considered survivable turned punitive. What they lacked was a captured example. That gap was deliberate. Allied policy kept VT shells away from ground where duds might be retrieved, prioritized use where misses fell into sea or friendly territory, and classified the device so tightly that even some frontline users did not know how it worked, only that it worked. A pilot shot down by a near burst might report perfect timing, and a signals officer might infer better radar solutions or faster directors. Few guessed that the fuse itself, the last inch of the kill chain, had changed the game. The material logic explains the operational effect. A VT fuse, tuned to radio wavelengths around 2 meters, could sense its own wave reflecting off an airframe. The relative motion created a Doppler beat in the receiver. A comparator circuit watched for a rising envelope. A thyrotron fired the detonator when the signal crossed threshold. None of that required the gun crew to know the target's exact altitude to a tenth of a second. It required only that the director put the shell into the neighborhood, and that the fuse do the final navigation. In a formation of fighters, where elements fly at near constant separation, one shell bursting at the right radius throws steel across multiple aircraft. Multiply that by a battery, and then by overlapping batteries around an airfield or port. And formations do not dissolve only because of fear. They dissolve because the geometry that used to give safety margins now gives overlapping fragment fields. Compare other theaters, and the pattern holds. At sea, where the U.S. Navy tracked ammunition expenditure and hits with severe bookkeeping, 5-inch guns with VT accounted for a large share of kills against both conventional and suicide attackers late in the war. And rounds per kill fell into the low hundreds in some actions where mechanical time had once been in the thousands. On land, during the Anglo-American reports, noted that proximity-fused artillery airbursts, though a different use case, multiplied lethality against troops in woods and villages because the device removed the last guess in setting the burst height. The common thread is that VT collapsed the missed distance from meters to fragments. The Luftwaffe's cultural response mockery giving way to grim respect mirrors how human beings update beliefs under pressure. Pilots, with thousands of hours, instructing rookies to ignore most flak, because they'll never time it right at low level, were not stupid. They were calibrated to 1942's physics and 1943's weapons. In 1944, the Defender changed physics at the detonation point. The pilots who laughed at the idea of clever shells in October were often in hospital or missing by February. And the men who replaced them learned a stripped-down survival rule. Avoid defended corridors. If you must go, go fast, go low. Never line up neatly, and never assume the battery is guessing. Even those adjustments could not save a force that no longer controlled the sky and could not afford losses to either fighters or guns. By spring 1945, the Luftwaffe could no longer mount massed daylight strikes in the west. The last flights that crossed belts around Antwerp or the Rhine bridges flew into a defensive network, reaching full technical maturity, early warning, height finders, automatic trackers, directors, and fuses that erased the final uncertainty. No single invention wins a war. Engines, fuel, training systems, code breaking, and 1,000 industrial miracles shape outcomes. But certain devices shift an entire category's cost curve. The proximity fuse did that for anti-aircraft fire. It changed the economics of defense by making each round a self-correcting threat volume. Against V1 South, it turned a humiliating math problem into a solvable one. Against low-level fighter bombers, it made the old low-altitude sanctuary leaky. Against ground forces in the Ardennes, it turned treetops into amplifiers. In every case, it rewarded already solid systems radar directors. Disciplined crews by removing the last human guess from the most time-critical step. The enduring lesson is not mystical. It is that war often pivots when someone moves the tuning knob from human timing to machine timing in the few seconds when timing matters most. For the Luftwaffe flyers who opened 1945 over Belgium, the pivot was visible in rings of white that burst when no hand had set them. They had laughed at the rumor that the Allies possessed a fuse that explodes when it feels like it. Then they watched formations come apart into singles and singles, into smoke as shells detonated at arm's length. The technical truth hiding inside the rumor was colder. The fuse did not feel. It measured, and by measuring it, made a century of gunners' luck unnecessary. That is why this device mattered, and why the men who survived that morning stopped laughing. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.